I was one of those who always told him, Pablo, I never told Patron. And then as soon as he saw me, he attacked me. And I saw that animal on top of me, and then I started running backwards with the cameras hanging here, but I didn't turn my back on him. I have a photo where he is, and you can see his little notebook and pencil in the foreground. And in the photo, he is even looking at me. People who had to see the violent way in which he lost control became irritated, and everyone was afraid of him. They were terrified of him. Many times we met there at the Hacienda in Naples having a few drinks. Pablo didn't drink. Pablo rarely had a beer. He liked marijuana. Anyone who had any ties to Pablo Escobar was a military target, even if it was just suspicion. And in other words, this man is a suspect, so let's kill him because he is a suspect. That is a mystery to me. I still haven't been able to understand why the Pepes didn't look for me, why they didn't take my file, why they didn't kill me.
How are you guys? I'm glad you're tuning in. Welcome. In this episode of Witness Invisible, we have a very special guest with a fascinating story to tell. We are joined by Edgar Jimenez, better known as Chino. He was Pablo Escobar's personal photographer and witness to one of the darkest and most complex chapters in recent Colombian history. Today from Medellin, Edgar reflects on those years, the risks he faced, and how he managed to survive even in the midst of the war between Escobar and the Pepes. From Medellin, Colombia, we give a warm welcome to Edgar Jimenez, El Chino.
How's everything going, okay?
Everything is excellent. It's a pleasure to have you on Witness Invisible and to know that you want to talk to us and tell us a little about your experience as a photographer.
Yes, I am 74 years old. I was born in 1950. When I was studying in high school in 1964, I was 14 years old. I joined the photography club at the Antioquia High School where I studied, and there, with my fellow members of the photography club, I started taking photos. And when I finished high school in 1968, I continued taking social photos to pay for my university studies. So I started as a social photographer. I started in 1968. Taking social photos between 1967 and 1968, and I still take social photos when friends and family call me and so on. They need me for a wedding, for their daughter's 15th birthday, and events like that. Now I dedicate very little time to it, but until about 10 or 15 years ago, it was one or two commitments of that kind every week, but also from 1970 onwards. In 1970, I was 20 years old. I was studying mechanical engineering at the University of Antioquia, and an important political movement in the history of the country began called ANAPO, which was an opposition movement that emerged as an alternative to the two traditional parties, liberal and conservative, that shared power. And so I liked that party because of its opposition stance, which, although it was not revolutionary or anything like that, they offered it as a novel alternative to differentiate it from the others. And so there, when I joined that political movement, I also began to venture into political photography, and then I quickly became the photographer of all the politicians of the National Opposition Alliance, and I was also the photographer of the presidential candidacy of Maria Eugenia Rojas, the great general, and later of many types of candidates. And after the Democratic Alliance, I went with others like the EPL, with many demobilized guerrilla movements that were already entering into political activity, and I became the photographer of all those political movements of demobilized guerrillas.
Wow, so you've never done anything else but take photos?
Only to photography as an economic activity.
And in those days, what camera did you use?
Fujica camera. When I started, it was with a Fujica camera. It was very useful because it had everything. It had an exposure meter, a rangefinder, a distance scale, a sensitivity scale, film, and all those things. And it was my first camera when I was 15 years old. I had a very appropriate camera to start studying because it had all the scales, and it had the exposure meter, and it had the superimposed figure field rangefinder and everything, same things. And then I got some cameras, a Contarex, a very good German camera, and then I had many cameras, Pentax, Canon, Rolleifresh, Jasica, many Minolta. I have had a wide range of cameras, and at one time I was using the Canon F1 camera a lot, the F1 new from the 80s, and then came the other computerized cameras, the Canon A1, etc., which already had 5 automatic exposure modes, and then came the digital era, and then, well, that's where we've been going, changing cameras as the technologies have also evolved.
Of course. So you've seen almost the entire process of the evolution of cameras, right?
Yes, well, I had to study analog photography more or less thoroughly because I started in 1966, the year 66, and well, it was analog photography and nothing more. The cameras were not automatic. It was much more difficult to take photos because you had to focus, think, for example, with a rangefinder. You had to measure the light with an exposure meter. You had to set the diaphragm, etc. If you were taking photos, they were manual. Then calculating the guide number and things like that. And all that was very fast. And they were rolls of film, 36 photos. And then one had to have a lot of experience to re-edit when you were taking effects events where you had to take a large number of photos, 400 or 500 photos at a time. Then you had to be constantly changing film at a high speed. And many times we don't have time to make measurements, calculations, or even focus, but calculate the distance. And then sometimes all that type of photography was more difficult, less exact, but it was what there was. Nowadays, everything is very easy. Now we go with a cell phone that is, it does wonders for you. They are very different things. One thing is to specifically look for what you want. There the cell phone is no longer useful. You have to know about photography to get a predetermined effect. The cell phone, people don't know how to take photos. People knew how to do it like that. But even so, these cell phones give very good photo quality.
How complicated or how easy has it been for you to get rid of that type of camera and use the ones from now, the ones from the present?
Changes are never easy, and let's say at the end of the last century, at the beginning of these new millennia, digital photography still didn't have the quality it has now. And then it was still said that analog photography surpassed it in quality and everything, and film was still much better. But technology has advanced so much that it is unquestionable that it has already surpassed analog. However, I still have the enlarger and I still have the laboratory.
Okay.
Yes, I still have it. And sometimes I still get that nostalgia of being in a dark room. So I set up the laboratory, the enlarger, the timer, all the trays, etc. And then I start taking photos with the analog method.
Wow.
But in any case, it is a new learning because the photographic base remains the same, but the digital technology is different. So I have to study more things.
Okay.
And small format and medium format cameras with large format cameras like tilting studio cameras, and that I never used it, but I did have medium format cameras like the Mamiya 67, the Mamiya RG67, the Mamiya C33 330, the Mamiya E3, and well, for the negative, which was a 6x6 negative, and in the Mamiya RG67 it was a 6x7 negative. There was much more quality of enlargement and definition and resolution than a 35mm negative. That's in terms of technical aspects.
Well, let's go into stories that you've lived throughout your career as a photographer. Tell me, what was your experience like being the photographer of Pablo Escobar himself?
Well, when I started taking photos in 1980, I met Pablo Escobar again at the Nápoles estate, which was in the early 1980s. I hadn't seen him for 15 years.
Oh, yeah, because you knew each other from school, right?
High school in the first, second, third, and fourth year of high school. That is in the year 1963, 64, 65, and 66. For 4 years, we were classmates in the same class, so you know that the friendships that are forged in high school, those friends from the last phase of childhood and entering adolescence are friendships that last a lifetime because of the camaraderie. And we played soccer, we played basketball, and in the games and during breaks. And our mother took care of us.
Wow.
And among classmates, we gave each other nicknames. That's when they gave me the nickname El Chino.
He put it on you?
Yes, but not because I had the Chinese fractions, but because I was born with a pronunciation defect. I have a hard time pronouncing the R, and certain conjugations like B with L, D with R, that makes it very difficult for me to pronounce. So they didn't understand me. After 16 years since I saw him, I didn't know much about him, already at the end of the 70s. year 78 or 79, Pablo Escobar began to have a certain notoriety as someone very wealthy and also participated in motor racing in a cup called Copa Renault. Then
Sí,
he also
claro,
appeared in
claro.
the sports pages of the newspapers, and one began to realize that Pablo Escobar, my classmate, was a motorist and that he also had a lot of money, and I already knew that, but I didn't have any kind of contact with him until the year 80 with a friend who was the ombudsman of Puerto Triunfo. Puerto Triunfo is the municipality where the Hacienda Nápoles is located.
Okay.
And my friend, who was also there when we were students, was named ombudsman of Puerto Triunfo. And he was someone who was very bold. And he immediately noticed the people from the Hacienda Nápoles. He got in touch with them. He noticed the people from the Hacienda de Nápoles. So he got in touch with them. He became friends with them. And one time when I went to cover a municipal festival in Puerto Triunfo, he invited me to go to the Hacienda Nápoles. He said that he was invited by the owner of the Hacienda Nápoles, a millionaire. And I became friends with them. He invited me to meet him. And we arrived at the Naples estate. And it was amazing because we arrived at the estate and the first thing we saw was this little plane at the entrance.
Yeah.
And there were a lot of people. And we started down a road surrounded by lakes on one side, lakes on the other side, and then a bullfighting arena. And
Wow.
and then there was a zoo and an estate of about 3,000 hectares with about 20 or 30 lakes and a jungle area and everything. Well, that was amazing. And when we got to the main part of the estate, well, there were also a lot of giant cages for birds because the birds were only in that part, which was restricted for most people. A lot of exotic birds, and so that was very intimidating. And when I went to meet Pablo, I thought, maybe I'm so old that he's forgotten about me, que me esté. And he said, oh, well, you're Chino. And he greeted me very formally. I was also happy. He asked me what I had done in those years, and I told him that I was a photographer. He hired me right away and said, man, that's great, man. I need a photographer to take photos of all the animals at the zoo so I can make an inventory of the animals, but a photographic inventory. So that's when I started taking photos of 2,000 animals. I had to go every 15 or 20 days, every month, to the planting and walk around the zoo, taking photos of the animals at the zoo. That's when I started contacting him. That was in 1980. And by 1982, at the beginning of 1982, he decided to get involved in politics. He wanted to be a representative of the chamber. He said that he already had economic power, that now he was going for political power, and his friends had already tricked him, and people told him yes, that he had all the capabilities, even to be president of this country, and he began to believe the story. He believed that he could be president of Colombia, and with all the money and all the power that money gave him at that time, he was considered one of the 4 richest men in the world, according to Forbes magazine, he and the Ochoas. And here in Medellin, it was the most powerful drug trafficking organization in the world at that time. And he had all the possibilities. And apart from that, at the end of 79 or beginning of the 80s, he was anointed by the Colombian mafia as the boss of bosses of the Medellin cartel. That is, in 1980, he was at the height of his power and wealth. And that photo where he is asleep, where he looks serene, sleeping there, coincides with the moment of maximum splendor of Pablo Escobar. I like it a lot for that reason too, because it marks the beginning of his parable, which is like the beginning of his economic power. And here he reaches the peak, and there precisely he reaches the peak of all his power. And I also have another photo where he was absorbed, pensive at a party, totally pensive. But it was in 1989 when he already had all that load of problems on top of him, all those deaths on top of him, those attacks. That year he had killed Galan. That year the Avianca plane blew up. That year was the most tragic year in the history of the country. At that moment he was pensive, thinking about all that load of things and thinking surely about everything that was coming, and that already marks the beginning of the end of his power. I like those 2 photos a lot because they are like the tip of a story and a tragic sign, the beginning and the end, and the beginning of the tragic sign of Pablo Escobar, because in the end his life was tragic.
Well, and I've seen quite a few documentaries and series about Pablo Escobar. It is said that the idea of hiring a photographer was because he was very egocentric. He knew that he was going to be a character in history. Is that really true?
I know that he sensed it. He sensed it, but not me. I never sensed that Pablo Escobar was going to become the character that he became, because if that had been the case, the photos I had of Pablo Escobar would be many more, many more. I would have followed him everywhere. Many times. I didn't go to many events. They invited me, that he was going to be there. They called me to go, and I didn't go. And I was a bit disdainful. I had this position as Pablo Escobar's photographer that everyone wanted to have.
Of course.
And I disdained it. If you notice, that's how I was. That's how I was. I had all his trust. I had the photo booth of Pablo Escobar. Everyone wanted that photo booth of Pablo Escobar. And I didn't care much about that. And I never imagined that Pablo Escobar was going to become by far the most famous bandit in history, and also one of the most charismatic, because Pablo, despite being a bandit and a murderer and a criminal and all that, and all the immense damage he did to Colombian society, well, I don't know, he had a charisma that he still preserves it, because Pablo's charisma is undeniable, because it's a matter of seeing all the tourists who come here to Medellin every day by the dozens, and they all want to know where Pablo Escobar is. They want to know his story. If they want to go everywhere, they want to have souvenirs related to Pablo Escobar. And that's a phenomenon, a mass phenomenon. It's a total phenomenon. And not only here, it's the eternal world. Anywhere you go, if you travel more than I do, you will realize that in many countries around the world, in Finland, in Iceland, in Asia, in so many places, Pablo Escobar is a totally recognized figure.
Now, what was it that most caught your attention about Pablo Escobar? The fact that he treated you so well, because you were not dealing with an employee of Pablo Escobar, you were dealing with the leader of the Medellin cartel. So what do you think is behind this familiar behavior towards you?
Well, the truth is that you know that in high school there are two types of students who are recognized and remembered forever, which are those who are very bad students, who are guys that when you see them you say, oh, this one is hopeless. The bad ones, and the good students who get good grades and so on, who occupy the first positions, are also very remembered. And I was a good student, and I got very good grades, and I was always occupying the first positions. And then Pablo realized that as a student was outstanding, and then of course I was very remembered, and also because of the nickname, because those of us who have a nickname are also easier to remember. It is not the same to remember Mr. Edgar Jimenez than El Chino. Many people do not know my name. 80% of the people I know do not know that my name is Edgar. Everyone knows me as El Chino. I have been carrying around that nickname for more than 60 years, which has supplanted my true identity. That is my true identity. El Chino. In fact, if you notice, the book is titled like that. The book is titled El Chino. That is me riding an elephant. And the book is titled El Chino, The Life of Pablo Escobar's Personal Photographer.
Wow, that's great. And with the experience of being a photographer and applying all this photographic technique with Pablo Escobar, was there any situation that impacted you, made you think at that moment, what am I doing here?
No, the truth is that I never did. I liked it. I liked to constantly travel to the Naples estate to take photos of those animals. I really liked going into that zoo. Also, because of my absent-minded way of being, I didn't realize the dangers I faced. I had danger right next to me, and I didn't realize it until after they shot me. That's how I am. I've always been like that. I think that's perhaps what has saved me from so many difficult situations that I've been through. But I think that it's like that unconsciousness that I was born with that, and I, for example, went into that Naples estate zoo, and I thought that those animals weren't dangerous because they weren't carnivores. There at the Hacienda Naples, in the zoo, there were 2,000 animals, but they were not wild. They were not animals like lions. There were no animals of that type. There were no predators. They were all vegetarian animals, but there were rhinoceroses, there were hippos, there were elands, there were some African animals with horns of this size. Well, many types of animals. And before they were wild animals that can continually attack. And in fact, I was attacked a few times. And perhaps the worst danger I had was when I was attacked by an ostrich, a male ostrich. Yes, because I walked alone, just for that. It is logical to go by car. And another thing is to get in the middle of an animal. Now, I have a photo of me riding a rhinoceros. Also, in the book, I have that photo of me riding an elephant, but I also rode a rhinoceros, and my partner saw me and took the photo. And when those hippos arrived, none of them knew that those animals were so dangerous. They were very dangerous, but they didn't know. The people at the zoo didn't know. And I took a photo of the hippos that arrived.
They are very dangerous.
And they had them there in a lake, next to one of those lakes. And there they served them carrots. And there were two hippos eating the first ones that arrived. And I got close to about 4 meters away without any kind of protection, which are the famous photos of the first two hippos that arrived there, which we call Adam and Eve. Now, there are more, almost 200 hippos in Colombia. They were the first, and those animals, those hippos, were locked up in the same habitat with some camels because they thought those hippos were harmless. And no, until a hippopotamus saw one of those camels and bit its belly and ripped its guts out, pulled out its intestine and killed it. There, they realized how dangerous hippos were, so they isolated them in some lakes alone and with a high fence and all that. Well, and when the ostrich attacked me, well, I took photos of it and often got quite close and all that. And what happened? That male ostriches have dark black plumage and females have sepia brown fur. And I was passing nonchalantly through the middle of the male and the female, but the male was in heat. And then as soon as he saw me, he attacked me, and I saw that animal on top of me. So I started to run backwards with the camera hanging here, but I didn't hit him in the back. And when he was already on top of me, about to kick me, I started to run like this in a zigzag. And when I ran in a zigzag, he turned around and lost speed. And that was the moment that one of the people who take care of them, who feeds them, took advantage of it and came and grabbed him by the neck and started to tie him up. And then I was able to slip away and I escaped. And I got into a shed where they kept food. If I had turned my back on him, he would have kicked me in the spine and broken it. There was also one time when a llama spat on me. And so a cassowary, which is an Australian bird that is about 1 meter tall, that has hooves, fingers like daggers, and I got within 2 meters of it. And then when I went to find out what kind of animal it was, I went to the library at the Naples estate where there were many animal encyclopedias. I realized that it was a cassowary, and the cassowary is considered the most dangerous bird in the world. There, the Australian Aborigines, when the birds are young, keep them as pets, but when they get older, they kill them, eat them in the bush, because they become very dangerous and they have killed many people. Because with one of those hooves, it can stab someone and kill them. Well, these are things that one didn't know about.
Incredible.
And they are dangers that one runs there without realizing that at the time, nothing happened to it, but that it was in danger of something happening to it.
How lucky that you survived that and continued with your life as Pablo Escobar's photographer. The famous notebook always caused a lot of curiosity. In the series, Pablo Escobar always carried a notebook. You, who were so close to him, could you see what he wrote in it?
No, that notebook is the one he had in his pocket. Pablo, one of the outfits I remember most about Pablo was always jeans. He really liked to walk around in jeans and sneakers, and he would also wear shirts or T-shirts like these, and here with a little pocket here. And he had that little notebook here, a little notebook that was this small, that fit here in this pocket, and then something that he had to write down there, or something like what we call mental magnets, some phrase or some word that reminds him of something he has to do, or a name of a person, for example, or someone that he has to eliminate. I have a photo of where he is, and you can see the notebook and the pen in the foreground. And he is looking at me, even at me, because I am higher up taking some panoramic photos. And he is looking at me because he was with a popular queen. That was at a political demonstration in a neighborhood of Medellin. And then the popular queen was on a balcony. She was there, and he approached her, and I climbed up to be able to take the photo, and then he was looking at me like that, and you could see the notebook in his pocket with the pen. That photo was very popular. It must be because of the connotation of the famous notebook that Pablo in El Patrón del Mal, the famous Colombian television series, put a lot of emphasis on, so that famous notebook caused a lot of curiosity.
Yes, that famous notebook caused a lot of curiosity.
He never behaved like a boss with me because he never was one either. I was simply a photographer whom he occasionally hired, so I did not have a subordinate relationship with Pablo.
Yeah.
But he used my photographic services because he considered me a person of absolute trust, and also because he liked my photos, he liked my work, and the family also knew me, and so I was also a friend of the family, the Henaus and the Escobars, and at parties, as a photographer, I always came and took part, because it is one thing to be invited to a party, and another thing to be hired to take photos. And as many friends as I had, Victoria herself was also a friend of mine, and she treated me very well and with great deference, and Pablo's sisters and sisters-in-law. But at a party, I would totally stay away. I was focused on my work, but nevertheless, Victoria would pass by and ask me if I was being treated well, and then she would reappear, Victoria, Pablo's wife, with a glass of whiskey, and she would say, "Chino, have this glass of whiskey while the waiters and waitresses serve the people, guests." And there were details like that. Or at the end of the party, Victoria would tell me when she had taken too many photos around midnight, 1 in the morning, she would say to me, "Okay, Chino, don't take any more photos, come and join the party at the table." So I would sit there, and I would sit with her brothers, with Carlos Henao and with Fernando Henao, and with my brothers-in-law, who were very good friends of mine. And so Pablo always saw me too as more of a friend and as someone who provided him with the photographic service. But he never saw me as his employee, since everyone called Pablo boss or called him boss, except for the family and one or another very close friend who called him Pablo. I was one of those who always called him Pablo. I never called him boss. I never called him chief. And he also, when he wanted me to take a picture of him, he would say to me, "Oh, hey, Chino, come here. Can you do me a favor and take a picture with Manuela on that mare that the Mexican gave you?" That's what he would say to me. He would ask me for the favor, and I would jokingly say no. Then he would say, "Please do it," because he had good manners. He had good manners, and he was a polite guy with people. Oh, for example, you were a doctor, and they would introduce him to you and say, "This is Dr. Moises Olmos." Then he would address you as doctor. He would say, "Doctor this, doctor that." He treated people very well. Those who were his friends, the people who were invited to his estate, he treated everyone very well. And he treated his enemies very badly, because that's also true. But I didn't get to see that. I didn't get to see the way he treated his enemies, although other people told me that they could see the very violent way he would lose control. He would get angry, and they were afraid of him. They were terrified of him in those outbursts of his, but I didn't get to see that. This is what they told me.
Well, I'm going to ask you this question based on what you experience in your daily life with your brothers and friends. Many times we have very passionate friends, as we say in my country, Chile, who have a short fuse and get angry very quickly, and we're afraid that someone is going to provoke them, and then we tell them, "Don't take him seriously, he's just joking, don't pay attention to him." In this case, when Pablo, if you ever saw him angry, were you afraid of how he was going to react to the whole gang that surrounded him, including you?
No, never. Sometimes, yes, well, let's say many times. Sometimes we were gathered there at the Hacienda de Nápoles having a few drinks. Pablo didn't drink much. Pablo barely drank a beer. He liked marijuana, but he didn't have any other vices either. He was a very healthy person in terms of vices, and the only one who had marijuana, but he smoked it very discreetly while he was with friends, and he would go 20 or 30 meters from the estate, smoke marijuana, and come back, and it wasn't noticeable. And as for liquor, well, he didn't like liquor either. He would barely have a cocktail or a beer. But I did drink, and I did get drunk, and many others, but Pablo didn't. And in those meetings, he often went to work. He was also a very hard worker. And at those meetings, he often started to traverse. He also thought of himself as a troubadour. The trova is a confrontation between two typical small characters who wear sombreros, carriles, ponchos, and with bells and guitars wrapped around them in a confrontation with phrases, but that rhyme, that have cadence. Then one asks the other answers, the other attacks him, and the other also answers. Also in that way, Pablo already tended to confront the champions of the tropa here in Colombia, there at the Nápoles Hacienda. And then there in the middle of the trovas, they would throw harsh insults at each other and say certain things. But they was all, and playing soccer, I had to play a couple of games with Pablo Escobar there at the Nápoles Hacienda. Hacienda Napoles had a small soccer field, like a 7-on-7 game, a small lighted field. It had lighting. And on one side there were stands where people sat to watch the games. And I got to play a couple of times, and Pablo's opposing team was sometimes missing a player. So I said, what do you want me to tell you? I play Bordeaux, so they lent me shoes and I played. But I was never a good soccer player. I was always clumsy. And I was also nearsighted, so I had to wear glasses. But what I lacked in skill, I made up for in vehemence. And I was always very vehement when it came to playing soccer. And I always played with all my effort, and many times as an adult. And I'm still that thin and bony, but with very strong bones. So I would violently collide with whoever it was, but not without bad intentions, but out of sheer clumsiness. And now the coincidence is that both times I had to play as Pablo Escobar's enemy. He played forward and I was a defender. And every time I got the ball, everyone played for him. Here is this boss, there goes that boss, so that he could score goals. And since I was his enemy as a defender, I would go down on him with everything. And of course, we fell to the ground once or twice in a park. On the third fall, he stood up first, shook my hand and said, "Man, Chino, take it easy." So that was his size. And at the end of the game, already talking secrets, his friends would say to him,
Wow.
"We shouldn't play with Chino anymore, boss. Didn't you see how he kicked?" And he would say, "No, well, Chino is rough when it comes to playing soccer, but he's not malicious. And apart from that, soccer is for men." That's how he was.
In reality, it's more the negative side that is said about him. But in your case, who was taking photos of him all that time? What was the most human photo that you were able to capture of Escobar?
The most humane, most humane and also the most paternal photo were several photos I took of him with his daughter, with Manuela. Pablo distinguished himself as he was a bandit and as he was a murderer and as he was a criminal. If he had not followed that path, history would have been different. If things had not been as they were, let's say the extradition treaty would not have existed, history would have been different, and perhaps Pablo Escobar would not have existed either as the character he became. The extradition treaty was like the engine of all that transformation and the fight against that treaty. Well, going back to the question, he loved his mother very much, and he also loved his wife very much, but his greatest love, he also loved his son very much, but his daughter, Assistant Manuela, was Pablo Escobar's greatest love. And so of those 3 photos that I have of him with Manuela, in one they have their faces together and Manuela is like putting a finger here and he is making little bows and things, and in the other he is throwing her up when he had already killed many magistrates, judges, enemies, and had done so many things. He had planted bombs, he had planted car bombs, he had done everything, and he had caused a great national tragedy. He had already become a terrorist. These photos were taken when he was already that, but I also have other photos of the lighting of the fields where he looks totally happy. All those kids who are also cheering him on because he got them a lighted field to play soccer, because he said it was much better for them, that the kids needed recreational spaces, that at night, instead of hanging out on the corner, smoking marijuana, doing nothing, wasting time, it was great that they had a lighted sports arena so that at night they could use it to play sports and participate in activities that were beneficial for them from the point of view of health and healthy recreational activities. And also when he gave away the houses, when he was building the Medellin de Tugurios neighborhood to give to those slum dwellers who had nowhere to live. Unfortunately, I didn't take photos at those meetings, but we had meetings with the people from the Civismo en Marcha program and from Medellin Sin Tugurios, who were in charge of building those houses and those sports arenas. And at those meetings, Pablo's great satisfaction at being able to give so many people a housing solution and to give those kids sports spaces came to the surface. Here in Colombia, I have been told a lot that Pablo did all of that, giving away those sports facilities and those houses to win the favor and popular support, so that they would vote for him. And yes, perhaps maybe he had that interest, but it was not the primary interest. And so much so that Pablo was elected representative of the chamber in April 1982 and began to serve as a parliamentarian in August 1982. And during that entire half of the year of 1982 and throughout the year 1983 was where the greatest push was given to the construction of sports spaces. to the construction of those courts of multi-sport spaces, of steps, of things in the popular neighborhoods, of the Medellin without slums neighborhood that continued to advance and advance.
Yeah.
And he was already a parliamentarian. He no longer needed the votes. He had already managed to be a parliamentarian, so it shows that it was not to get the votes, but because it came naturally to him, because people can be very bad, but they can also have certain feelings that are human and that humanize them.
What consequences did working with Pablo Escobar leave on your personal life? Have you had any kind of discrimination, or do they point to you saying that he was a criminal like Escobar?
Well, there has been very little rejection. It has been exceptional because of this book that was written about me, because we had several conversations, the writer of the book and I, several conversations to promote the book, to promote it in different settings. And then in many of those settings, we also met victims and relatives who had been victims of Pablo Escobar's violence. And they came to those conversations with a certain predisposition and a certain animosity towards someone who had been his photographer. But as soon as the conversation began, and through the conversation, they began to realize who I was and also what my definitive position was regarding the character that was Pablo Escobar. And that I always ended up concluding that ultimately Pablo Escobar had been a disastrous person for the history of the country, but that he had been my friend, and that I had basically photographed rather the good side of the bandit, and that he was my friend, and that personally he had not done anything against the victims, and I was totally aware of the harm that he did not only to the country but to society, Colombia and the entire world, as the head of the Medellin cartel. And with that indiscriminate violence that he exalted, like the attack against the Avianca plane, the attack on the building of the Administrative Security Department, the deaths of all those judges, police officers, magistrates, and so many people, that there was no justification whatsoever, and that his legacy was totally disastrous because he left us the hitmen. He taught the youth that through fear and weapons they could subdue and dominate society. So when people saw that that was my definitive position, then they changed their attitude towards me. Besides, most people recognize me and tell me that I am very famous, and they even take photos with me, and many times I am there, and there are tourists, and they know that I am Pablo Escobar's photographer. Many times I had to go to the cemetery on other matters and be there in the neighborhood, Medellin without slums. And there is no shortage of people who tell a group of 15 or 20 tourists from various parts of the world that I was Pablo Escobar's photographer, and right there everyone wanted to take photos with me. They asked me without me being anyone special, but for the mere fact that I had been the photographer of the most famous bandit, so they wanted to take photos with me.
And the closeness that he had with the Escobar family after Escobar's death, did he maintain any contact with the family, who now live in Argentina?
Yes. After Pablo Escobar's death, I gradually lost contact with them, but I continued taking photos of them until 2000, 2001. It's been about 20 years since I took any more photos of them, because the rise of digital photography and cell phones also arrived. They didn't hire me anymore. Before, they hired me for all kinds of photos, but now everyone has their cell phones, so they don't need a photographer anymore. They take their own photos, so my service isn't really needed anymore. Now people hire us for very specific photos, like weddings, quinceañera birthdays, which require a more special type of photo, more elaborate, etc. And to tell a story well, like a wedding or things like that. And so they don't trust that with cell phones, and that, well, a story about a wedding can be built, for example. But before, they hired us for all kinds of occasions. When someone turned 1 year old, 2 years old, 1 month old, 3 months old, they hired photographers for everything. But with the arrival of technology, digital photography, and especially cell phones, with the high quality of the photos they now produce, they have gradually made social photographers less important. That is why after 2001 or 2002, I was no longer very needed by them. And it has been 20 years since they last called me. But after his death, and for about 8 years after that, I continued being a photographer for the Henao family and the Escobar family. And I even took some photos of my colleague and brother-in-law, who was there in that tall building in Campestro, where we took many photos. We took so many photos, but Victoria was no longer here in Colombia, but was in Argentina. So I had to go take the photos and also take a friend to sign them, to send all those photos to Victoria so she could see what the parties were like and all that. But not with Victoria anymore. It has been many years
Yeah.
since I've spoken to her. And she has already settled in Argentina, but I think she often comes here to Colombia, and I was able to come, and so was Juan Pablo. I never had much of a relationship with Juan Pablo because he was a child. When I started taking photos, he was 2 or 3 years old. So I never became friends with Juan Pablo.
You enjoyed a fairly large privilege with Escobar. They even treated you like family. But did that privilege extend to when he had parties with other drug lords?
There were many parties that were held in which I was not present. I was basically at more social parties that had to do with family events, such as the first communion of one of the nieces, the wedding of Pablo's sister, Victoria's birthday, Juan Pablo's birthday.
Yeah, okay.
But those parties, those bacchanals that they organized, they held them in Naples and in many other places because there were many estates and places where they did things. And well, I was not invited because, among other things, well, Pablo was not interested in those bacchanals and those orgies, those parties that they held being recorded in photos and falling into the hands of Victoria. I was not invited to that because his partners and his people were invited. So I was not present at those types of events. Nor was I interested, nor did I want to. I was not going to like being there.
Ah, how interesting. You could refuse and not attend.
It's not my style, nor is it the type of parties that I like, nor is it the type of friends and conversations that I like, because I like a different type of bohemian life with friends who are more into literature, poetry, art, chess, which I'm very fond of chess, and also billiards, because I play billiards, and politics, which are very different topics of conversation from the topics of conversation I had with him, because the topics of conversation of those people were not of interest to me.
When it became a search for Escobar by the Pepes, this group was on a mission to kill everyone who was related to Escobar. The question that comes to mind, what are you doing alive? Because I imagine you were one of the targets, right? One of the people that the Pepes were looking for.
That is a mystery to me. I still have not been able to understand why the Pepes did not look for me, why they did not take my file, why they did not kill me, because they would have killed me. Because in mid-92, Pablo was imprisoned in La Catedral. That is when he killed the Moncada and the Galeano. That episode that everyone knows about, the death of the Moncadas and the Galeanos, who were his partners, and he killed them in La Catedral for some money they had in Calitao. And that is a case that I knew enough about. And then as a result of the death of the Moncadas and the Galeanos in La Catedral, it generated the intervention of the government of Cesar Gaviria, who could not allow it because, apart from all the excesses, that it was a 6-star hotel, that they did what they wanted, that everyone went there, and that they were already killing people there. That was like the straw that broke the camel's back, and there was fear in the government, so it was decided to intervene, and that is where he fled. And when Pablo killed his partners, who had been partners for many years of the Medellin cartel, Kiko Moncada and Galeano, Fernando Galeano, and before that he had killed others. Pablo also killed others. Petilio Valencia had killed several drug dealers and had taken the widow's property, and those drug dealers felt threatened. And because of that, the Pepes emerged, led by Fidel and Carlos Castaño, who had been his partners. Carlos Castaño himself says that he appreciated Pablo, but that later he hated him with all his soul, because Carlos Castaño was like that, and Fidel was the older brother, and they were the initiators of the Pepes, along with the survivors of the Moncada and the Galeano, Mireya Moncada and the other brother of the Galeano, and other relatives, Don Berna, who was their bodyguard, and there were also people from the Cali cartel who were also enemies of Pablo Escobar, and those from the cartel of the north of the Valle. So they formed an entire alliance of enemies of Pablo Escobar, who saw that at any moment they were going to be killed. And so they allied themselves and began to confront Pablo Escobar with the same methods that he used, that is, kidnapping family members, friends, blowing up their properties. Then they began blowing up Pablo Escobar's properties and farms, his mother's, and killing a large number of friends. Several of my friends died there. Several of my friends were murdered by the Pepes. And Carlos Castaño said that anyone who had a relationship with Pablo Escobar was a military target, that it was just suspicion, That is, this person is suspicious, so let's kill him because he is suspicious. In other words, they didn't stop to ask how guilty that person associated with Pablo Escobar was or linked to him, but at the first suspicion they killed them. For example, a girl of about 20, 22 years old who was Manuela's teacher, since they couldn't attend school, Pablo's children, so they received private lessons.
Yeah, of
And
course.
a girl of about 22, 23 years old, who had nothing to do with anything, but was a teacher, gave private lessons to Manuela. And because she was Manuela's teacher, they killed her.
Wow.
Not that they killed anyone who had any kind of connection. And I had the connection of being her photographer. I had been the coordinator of her political campaign, and I was a friend, and I was also a friend of his. And I had photos that I took of her and her family,
Yeah.
and everyone knew about my work as a photographer.
Wow.
Everyone knew about it. And I lived in the center of Medellin, in a cafe called El Maracaibo, which is a chess and billiards club, and a bohemian atmosphere, very well known in Medellin, especially for chess. The best chess players in Colombia and many in the world passed through there.
Claro.
But later that Maracaibo club, which was born as a club for chess players, billiards players, and intellectuals in a time like the
Yeah.
mid-80s, was bought by some mobsters. Octavio Piedrahita, who owned the national football team, and the Piedrahitas, who were a mafia club, bought that club, and then that club was also transformed into a club of mafiosi and bandits and everything, and Los Priscos went there. Those from the terrace, all that bunch of bandits who worked with Pablo Escobar went there, and mafia friends of Pablo and people of all kinds went there. And in that club I was very
Yeah.
well known, and everyone knew that I was Pablo Escobar's photographer. So I can't understand why they didn't kill me. When the Pepes were in that
Yeah.
war against Pablo Escobar and all his friends and his entire family, they killed his relatives and they killed many of his friends, many people who had some kind of relationship with him. And then Pablo was denouncing that they were killing his family. He denounced it through the media. Then through one of his workers, who they called El Capi, he began to look for me to go to legal medicine, to look for the files of a lot of dead people that had been killed by the state security agencies and the Pepes, etc. People who were his friends, who
Yeah.
lent me the photos in the legal medicine department so I could reproduce them. And I went with a cousin of Pablo Escobar, with Jaime Gaviria, who has since died. He and I went at that time, and they did me the favor of lending me the archive. And I took all those photos, a ton of photos, and I brought those photos to Capi. And with those photos, Pablo took out a full-page ad in the newspaper, in several newspapers in the country. A full page with all those photos of dead people murdered by the Pepes and by the security agencies of the Colombian state, my relatives and my friends, etc. And that was a complaint that Pablo filed against him. And I brought those photos to Capi in a cafe that was in front of the Maracaibo Club, which was also called Maracaibo. It was called the Maracaibo Ice Cream Parlor. And there one morning I brought the photos to the guy, and he took them. And a month or 2 months later, that Capi was caught somewhere near the center, on a street. They took him out of a cafeteria, they kidnapped him, they tortured him, and the Pepes killed him. So you realize that I was saved, and I don't understand why.
Did you take any precautions? Were you hiding somewhere?
I drank every day. And Jaime Gaviria, Pablo Escobar's cousin, Pablo's cousin, and Gustavo's cousin, was a very good friend of mine, and he was also an alcoholic. But that Jaime Gaviria, apart from being an alcoholic, was also a drug addict. He was a cocaine addict. He was vicious. Not me. I just liked liquor. But I got drunk every day. And on top of that, I would cause scandals there in those pool halls. And there everyone knew me. I was friends with everyone. Everyone knew me. El Chino, El Chino, El Chino is causing scandals. And I would cause disorders. And I would go out drunk and alone on the street. I would also go out walking alone to hail a taxi. So I think they said about me, this guy is crazy, drunk all the time. I suppose that was perhaps one of the reasons why they didn't pay much attention to me.
Okay. How incredible. Wow. Did you keep any souvenir of Escobar?
Through his friends and his lieutenants, he would send me what we call here a league, that is money, which was a gift. So he would ask about me, and they would tell him, no man, Chino is there. You know he is poor, he is not wealthy. To which Pablo would respond, take this money to Chino. He would send me money, and he would send it to me through friends. One time I sent him a letter to La Catedral through a cousin and a friend who went to visit him, and they asked me if I would send him a message. So I sent him a message with a poem by Bertolt Brecht, that famous poem that says that there are men who fight one day, that there are men who fight every day, and those who fight every day are the essential ones. So I sent him that poem because he was fighting with everyone in that war. So I sent him the poem as a motivation at least. And he sent me a letter saying, "Thank you very much for the poem." And he wrote me a message and signed it, and that is what I have as a very personal memory of Pablo. Oh, and also the book of cartoons that he wrote. Pablo Escobar was in the news every day. He was in the news every day, not only in Colombia but in the whole world and here in Colombia, until one day he got tired of seeing news about Pablo Escobar with all the things he did when he escaped, when he committed a crime, when this, when that, when so many things. And outside the newspapers he also published many cartoons. All the cartoonists in Colombia published countless cartoons related to everything Pablo Escobar did. And since he had a big ego, he commissioned someone to put all those cartoons together, and with those cartoons he published a book. That book is well known. I don't know if you know it. The book was called Caricatures of Pablo Escobar, and it is a book of 300 pages, something like that, 400 pages. And it came with a card with the embossed signature and the fingerprint of Pablo Escobar, and he sent the book of caricatures to me. But what happened to that book? His cousin Jaime Gaviria, the vicious one, told me once to lend it to him, and I lent it, and I never saw it again. He took that book, I think he sold it, and spent the money on his vices. He stole it from me.
That book was very valuable, huh?
And he still has it. There are collectors who pay a lot of money for it, but that's where I lost a bill, a silver coin in the memory, because it was a limited edition that he released and gave to family and friends among whom I was.
There are several iconic photos of Escobar that you took. This question comes to mind. People with a lot of money pay very well for exclusive material. In this case, your photos. Someone has approached you to say, "You know what? I'll pay for all the original photos you have of Pablo Escobar. I'll give you this amount."
Yes, many private collectors buy photos of Pablo from me. Not all of them, but they do buy some of them, and I have sold them. And I have sold them photos of Pablo Escobar, but someone who can tell me. I buy all the photos that he has. Well, they haven't made me any natural offers yet, because what I sell is not the negative, but copies. That is, I can make 20, 30, 100, 1,000 copies of a photo. So I sell copies of those photos. But to sell, let's say, the archive, I would have to sell the negatives of the photos. Do you understand? And my entire archive is made up of negatives because I took photos of Pablo Escobar until the year. The last photos I took of him were in 89. But of Juan Pablo, Manuela, and the family, well, I have a ton of unpublished family photos, and I have a lot of photos of Juan Pablo and of Manuela. I have a lot of photos that nobody knows about, and I have a lot of photos of Victoria that are unknown, and of the Escobar family. I have a lot of photos that are not known about, and there I have them. And yes, those photos are all taken with film because they are analog photography. They are not digital photos, so they are photos that are backed up in the negatives. There are many negatives that I scanned and digitized, and now I copy them digitally, but the negatives are there.
Do you still have the camera with which you took the photos of Escobar?
Yes, I kept several of those cameras. The famous photo I took of him sleeping in 1980 was with a Pentax camera, a Pentax Spotmatic, which I still have. I have it there at home as another souvenir there, like in the museum. Some other cameras, yes. Well, if there is someone who would like to have that camera that I took those photos with, well, I don't know. Maybe.
I can already see you becoming a millionaire next month, ah? Something tells me that you're going to do well with that business.
I think that at 74 years old I will die as I was born and as I have lived. I have never had a lot of money. I am not a wealthy person, nor am I a person who has ambitions regarding material things. And I have been rather like an idealist in many things, but I have not lived badly. But my idea of happiness is very different from having a lot of material goods or having money. No, my happiness is of a different kind.
I think that here we would close the cycle of what it was like to be Pablo Escobar's photographer. Could you briefly tell me a second story of what you did as a photographer?
My archive is full of debts because Colombia, it is not something that is unknown, is one of the most violent countries in the world. In Colombia, violence has always dominated us. We were born in an era that is known in Colombia as the violence. It is an era that goes from the death of a very important political leader, one of the most important men in the history of the country, which is Jorge Eliezer Gaitan, who was a political leader of the people, who moved the masses, moved the crowds, and was assassinated by the Colombian oligarchy. And we were born, Pablo and I, exactly in the middle of that violent era. Pablo was even more of a victim of violence than I was, because there were liberals and conservatives who set the people against each other to kill each other. And I lived in the city, and in the cities the liberal conservative violence was not as serious or as large as in the countryside. But Pablo Escobar's mother, who was a teacher, at that time when Pablo was about 3 years old, he was a child, 2 or 3 years old, she was a teacher in a town called Titiribí, and Pablo Escobar's mother was of liberal affiliation, and that town was basically conservative. And one day the conservatives there wanted to kill her, and she managed to escape from that horde of conservatives who were going to kill her. And of course she was able to escape with Pablo Escobar, who was a child. And so I've been taking photos since 1970. I've had to take photos of many friends who have been victims of all that kind of violence. So what am I telling you? I have photos of friends who were victims of the FARC guerrillas, for example, who were killed by the FARC. Yeah, I have photos of friends who were killed by Carlos Castaño's paramilitaries. I have photos of friends who were killed by drug traffickers. I have photos of a lot of friends who were killed by state security agencies. And a lot of friends who were killed by common criminals. So in my archive there are a lot of dead people, as well as friends of mine who have been victims of all kinds of violence that Colombia has had. So I gave you that preamble of the successive acts of violence that we have had in this country, and of which I have not been there taking photos when they were killed or anything like that, but rather they have been friends who have been victims of that violence, and at some point in their lives I have taken photos of them, and they have remained in my archive. And in this book some of those stories appear.
Wow. Is that book on the market right now?
Actually, the print run was very small. It's a 400-page book with 120 photos, and more or less half of the photos were taken with Pablo Escobar, and the other half are from other parts of my life, like what I'm telling you, from other stories. And it's a book that's fine. It's made of good paper. It's a sewn book, etc. Well made, well produced, and it barely had a print run of 1,000 copies, and therefore, since the print run was so small, the cost per unit increased a lot. So of those 1,000 books that we published, about 800 have been sold, and around 200 are still for sale.
And it is only sold in Colombia, or can be found here in the US?
In Colombia, the publisher, Universo Centro, is the one that has them. And well, no, the book has not been translated or anything like that, but it is a book that is available here in Colombia, and there are some places that still sell it.
Okay. Then we let the audience know that if they are visiting Colombia, do not hesitate to buy the book, so they can find out more stories.
Surely you know John Lee Anderson. Do you know who he is? John Lee Anderson is one of the most renowned and well-known journalists in the entire world. He is a columnist for The New Yorker, and he has many books that have been huge successes. The most famous biography of Che Guevara, entitled Che, A Revolutionary Life, was written by John Lee Anderson. He also wrote about the fall of Pinochet, the fall of Baghdad on Saddam Hussein, and he travels around the world, about Ethiopia and everywhere in the world he travels.
I remember.
And John Lee Anderson even interviewed me about 6 years ago at the time of the boom of the narco tours. Then the phenomenon of the narco tours, well, John Lee Anderson wanted to come to Colombia to see what that phenomenon was like, that boom and that transcendence for Escobar. So he took advantage of the fact that in 2017 he had to come to interview Maduro in Venezuela. And then with the proximity to Colombia, he commissioned Alfonso Buitrago, who is the author of the book and is a journalist and writer. So he contacted him, and he, through Rosalind Bain, an English producer from ITT, she gave him my contact. And then this writer, who I didn't know, contacted me and told me that John Lee was interested in interviewing me. So that's where I met John Lee Anderson, and there he interviewed me. And he interviewed Popeye, he interviewed Roberto Escobar, brother of Pablo, also the former mayor of Medellin, Alonso Salazar, who is the author of perhaps the best biography of Pablo Escobar, which is La Parábola de Pablo, The
Sí, la
Parable
parábola
of
de Pablo.
Pablo
Yeah, yeah.
is by far the best biography that has been written about Pablo Escobar. Of course, there are many others that touch on other topics, but this one is the best, and it was the
Claro,
basis
claro.
for the series El Patrón del Mal. They interviewed the current mayor of Medellin, Federico Gutierrez, who was also mayor at the time, because Federico was running for mayor. So they
Yeah, yeah,
interviewed
yeah.
all of us for a story in the New Yorker. Through that interview, I met Alfonso, the writer, and we went to Napolis, to the Napolis estate. I accompanied them. We chatted throughout the day. They began to realize who I was. They didn't know me.
Wow.
Alfonso said that my stories were worth a good story for a newspaper called Universo Centro, which is a literary newspaper for intellectuals here in Colombia. After some time, he told me that my story was worth more, that it was good for a book. So he wrote a book. And here John Lee Anderson, who read the book later, published a review. And there is also another one by Alonso
Okay.
Salazar, who wrote La Parábola de Pablo, and another one by a Canadian writer who has read the book. And the review of the book has been very good.
So how about we go with the third story, my friend?
Well, yes, among all those stories that you told me about my archive, well, and memories of people that I photographed, the EPL, the Popular Liberation Army, was a guerrilla group that emerged more or less at the same time as the FARC and the ELN. They emerged more or less at the same time, but the ELN did not mobilize. There are negotiations,
Okay.
and neither did the FARC, but there are dissidents. The EPL and the ELN mobilized at the beginning of the 90s, and from that movement of the EPL, Popular Liberation Army, a political movement emerged called Hope, Peace and Freedom, now as a legal political movement. And the EPL operated fundamentally in an area here in Colombia, in the department of Antioquia called El Urabá, which has a coast on the Caribbean Sea and is one of the most fertile regions of the country. And many fronts and guerrilla groups have operated there. When the EPL mobilizes, the EPL becomes a political party and immediately becomes a strong opponent, a politically strong contender of the UP, of the Patriotic Union, which was the political movement affiliated with the FARC. Then the FARC begins to see the hopefuls as enemies, and they treat them as traitors for having demobilized. Then they begin a campaign of extermination against the demobilized guerrillas of the EPL. The FARC kills more than 500 demobilized EPL members. The FARC, a guerrilla movement massacring a demobilized and unarmed guerrilla movement, more than 500 dead.
Wow.
Several of my friends died there. Among those deaths, there was a very famous massacre that you can look up on Google.
Wow.
Called the Chinita Massacre. La Chinita was an invaded neighborhood, which I also took photos of when they were invading it, but it is a large neighborhood, already fully consolidated, that is called a working class neighborhood. It is already called Barrio Obrero de la Chinita, and it is a good neighborhood with many downtown houses, and mainly for banana workers because it is a banana zone. But since the militancy was of hope for freedom, then the FARC saw it as a military target, and at a popular festival, the FARC arrived at night and when they killed like 36 people. That was a massacre.
And among those, were there children, women, etc.?
Children, the elderly, everything. They were going for several friends of mine, including Mario Agudelo. Mario Agudelo, when the EPL mobilized and became a political movement, became the head of that political movement and later became a deputy in the Departmental Assembly of Antioquia and became a deputy through legal means. And since he was declared an enemy of the FARC, Mario was the target of several attacks, but he was saved from several attacks. In one of those attacks, he was in an ice cream parlor in the window, and two guys on motorcycles arrived, and one of them left and threw a grenade at him that fell at his feet and didn't explode, but the grenade exploded when an employee who was serving him, a waitress, was passing by, and she received the full force and was killed. And Mario was hit by some shrapnel here, and he was saved from that. And that happened when I was already a deputy in 1997 or 1998. When I was a deputy, I was a very good friend of his because I also coordinated his political campaign. He was a friend of mine, and I was in the offices of the Departmental Assembly. He was a deputy from Antioquia. I was in the offices of the government of Antioquia. and in the Departmental Assembly of Antioquia there, when a guy from a courier agency from Colombia arrived with a package for him. It was a package that looked like a book, but it was wrapped in a craft paper, opaque paper, and it was for Mario. The secretary put it on the desk, and the sender was a guy with the supposed last name Granada, like the grenades that explode, and the secretary called Mario. He wasn't there at the time, but she called him and told him that it had arrived, and she asked him who, and she said a sender with the last name Granada, and he said that he didn't know that sender, that it seemed suspicious to him, that she should send the book to the security of the Departmental Assembly. She sent the book to the security of the Departmental Assembly. At the security of the Departmental Assembly, they uncovered the opaque paper, and a book like this one appeared wrapped in transparent cellophane paper, and then they said, that's a medical book, and they put it back. So, well, there they put the book. And Mario wasn't there at the time, but I was with another friend, and so I took the book in my hands and I was going to open it, take off the cellophane to look through it, but then I thought, yes, it's okay that Mario is a very good friend of mine, and we are very good friends and everything, but it also seems disrespectful to me that I opened the book for him. So I went back and put it there, and then Mario arrived later at about 4 in the afternoon, and he was in the office with us for a while. And at 6 we said goodbye. He lived on the outskirts of Medellin in a country house, and he arrived home at about 7 with the book in his hands. His son was 17 years old and wanted to study medicine, and he was eating in the dining room with the prize he had won. And Mario went at 7 at night with the book and said, here, son, this book is medicine, so you can study. And then the boy put down the food, took the book, opened it, and bam, the explosion. Nothing was seen. The explosion killed him instantly. That was the most horrific murder that killed him. He was 17 years old, a boy, and he killed him.
And you had that package in your hands?
And I had that book in my hands. I wanted to open it, to look through it. And because of one of those things in life, I ultimately regretted it, because I considered it disrespectful to remove the wrapping paper from someone else's gift.
And the question that comes to mind is, do you feel safe in the area where you live?
Yes, because these things are already part of the past. But I could have been a victim of them too. I could have been a victim of Carlos Castaño too, because I was always on the left. I was always involved in the left. In fact, when we were in Napo, we made an alliance with the Communist Party. That's where I met them both. And we were in political campaigns. There we were in political campaigns, and here we were somewhere, and I took the photos.
Okay. Well, Mr. Edgar, I really appreciate your time. Thank you for sharing your experiences as a photographer. I send you a big hug to Colombia. Thank you very much for watching our content. Your support is essential to me. Don't forget to subscribe by clicking on the button below so you don't miss our next Invisible Witness podcast. See you in the next installment.